Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back. This is lesson 8 inshallah, and we're going to inshallah start with the name of Allah. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een, amma ba'd. We were discussing the various different Hanbali approaches to the exact same thing. So far I don't think you've been able to see any kind of contradiction between what the Hanbalis said. Yes, they might have emphasized certain points more than others. And once we go through some of the discussions, inshallah, of the more detailed discussions of Ash'ari Maturidi text, Aqidah, you'll actually see that exactly what has been stated with all of these really detailed quotes from Hanbali scholars and theologians. They're exactly the same, right? There's nothing in detail. They've just maybe emphasized certain points more than others, right? So we were in the midst of the discussion. The last quote that we had yesterday was from none other than Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, who is a great Hanbali scholar of Baghdad. So what we're going to do is today I'm going to move on to Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, again another great Hanbali scholar who died in 620 Hijri, right? So Ibn Qudama says, now he's got a famous book to his name anyway called Lum'atul I'tiqad, right, which I think has been published and I think maybe even translated into English as well. So Ibn Qudama says, وَكُلُّ مَا جَاءَ فِي الْقُرْآنِ, everything that comes in the Quran, أو صح عن المصطفى عليه السلام, that has been reliably transmitted from our Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam with regards to the Sifat al-Rahman, attributes of the most merciful one, وَجَبَ الْإِيمَانُ بِهِ, it is absolutely obligatory to believe in it, وَالتَّلَقِيهِ بِالتَّسْلِيمِ وَالْقَبُولِ, and to accept it with submission and to take it with submission and acceptance, وَتَرْكُ التَّعَرُّض, right, lahu, and but not to delve into it, not to get into it, not to try to investigate it and find out what exactly it means and so on. بِالرَّدِّ وَالتَّأْوِيلِ وَالتَّشْبِيهِ وَالتَّمْثِيلِ, he says either by rejecting it, so we should not get into it, to reject it, to try to interpret it, to create resemblance with it, or to create examples by it. وَمَا أُشْكِلَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ وَجَبَ إِثْبَاتُهُ لَفْظًا, whatever is complicated and obscure and that cannot be understood and comprehended, it is still wajib and obligatory to establish it in its wording, right? So what that means is that this is what Allah said, that's what it is, وَتَرْكُ التَّعَرُّضِ لِمَعْنَاهُ, but to avoid going and delving into its meaning, and then we leave its knowledge and its understanding to the one who said it, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and that is the way to follow the way of the rasikhina fil ilm, those who are firmly grounded in knowledge. That's what he said. So inshallah we'll carry on with this. So to carry on with Ibn Qudama, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Ibn Qudama rahimahullah also says, right, and he's got a famous book on Aqidah as well, right? وَالصَّحِيحُ أَنَّ الْمُتَشَابِهِ مَا وَرَدَ فِي صِفَاتِ اللَّهِ سبحانه وتعالى مما يجب الإيمان به ويحرم التعرض لتأويله كقوله سبحانه وتعالى الرحمن على العرش استوى. So he says that the reliable opinion, the correct opinion, the sound opinion is that the mutashabih, which means the ambiguous terms, are that which have been related and revealed with regards to the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, among those which is wajib for us to believe in, but it's haram and unlawful to try to go ahead and interpret it, right? So you see, this is the view, which might be slightly different in the sense that many of the Ash'aris would say that it would be allowed to interpret it in a suitable manner, whereas they're very strict and say there should be no interpretation according to this hadith anyway. كَقَوْلِهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى, for example, the verse in Surah Taha, verse 5, Ar-Rahmanu al-Arsh istawa, that the Rahman is istiwa on his arsh, which means established on his arsh, if you want to translate that. Another one, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 64, بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ, his two hands are expanded. Verse 75 of Sad, لِمَا خَلَقْتُ بِيَدَيَّ, of that which I created with my hands. وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ, Surah Al-Rahman, verse 27, and the countenance of your Lord will endure. تَجْرِي بِأَعْيُنِنَا, Surah Al-Qamar, verse 14, which is that it sails in front of our eyes, right? In front of our eyes, and others. All of these, he says, are basically the mutashabihat verses. This is the sahih opinion, that these are the mutashabihat verses, and one should be very careful how they approach them. وَلِأَنَّ فِي الْآيَةِ قَرَائِنْ تَدُلُّ عَلَى أَنَّ اللَّهَ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى مُنْفَرِدٌ بِعِلْمٍ. And in the verses themselves, there is a contextual clue which indicates that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone is unique and independent with the knowledge of the interpretation of these obscure and unexplainable texts, that only Allah knows and have the knowledge of this. So now, then he answers some really important questions, right? He says, فَإِنْ قِيلَ فَكَيْفَ يُخَاطِبُ اللَّهُ الْخَلْقَ بِمَا لَا يَعْقِلُونَ. Right? If somebody makes an objection and says that, so why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addressing humans, creation, with something they can't comprehend? Why does he even bring them in the first place if they can't, if they're not meant to be comprehended by them? Right? That's what he's asking. أَمْ كَيْفَ يَنْزِلْ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ مَا لَا يَطَّلِعْ عَلَى تَأْوِيلِهِ. Why would something be revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he would not be aware, whose interpretation he would not be aware of? So our response would be, he says, يَجُوزُ أَن يُكَلِّفَهُمُ الْإِيمَانِ بِمَا لَا يَطَّلِعُونَ عَلَى تَأْوِيلِهِ. That it's absolutely possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing wrong with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making them responsible to believe in something that they don't, whose interpretation they don't know. It's just the test from Allah. You don't know interpretation, you're still obliged to believe in this, right? And accept it. لِيَخْتَبِرْ طَاعَتَهُمْ. So that he can test their obedience. كما اختبرهم بالإيمان بإيمان الحروف المقطعة مع أنه لا يعلم معناها. Just as he's tested them with the حروف مقطعات, like your alif lam mim ta sin ha mim ain sin qaf. All of these, nobody knows the meaning of them, but Allah has tested them. They're part of the Quran. You read them all the time. You say, I believe in them, right? You don't go around and say, oh, I believe in the haqiqah of them or the majaz of them. You don't say any of that discussion. We just leave that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allahu Akbar. Another discussion he has is, again, this is from Rawdatul Nadir wa Jannatul Munadir. And these are quotes from different places. The second quote that I have from him is that he says, فثبت بما ذكرناه من الوجوه أن تأويل المتشابه لا يعلمه إلا الله تعالى. So now it has become established based on the various different things that we have mentioned, that interpreting the ambiguous verses or hadith, the interpretation is only known by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ويلزم من هذا أن يكون المتشابه هو ما يتعلق بصفات الله تعالى وما أشبهه. And this necessitates that these ambiguous passages, they are what are associated with the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their like. Then after that he says, in another place he says, فَإِنَّهُ لَا حَاجَةَ لَنَا. Now, this is a quote from تحريم النظر في كتب الكلام, right? So he's quoted there as saying, there is no need for us, there is no requirement for us to have the knowledge of the meaning of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has intended of these attributes. We're not mukallaf, we're not responsible, so we're not going to get in trouble, we're not even required, it's not even an obligation, it's not even a recommendation. فَإِنَّهُ لَا يُرَادُ مِنْهَا عَمَلٍ. Because they're not commands, or they're not aspects to calls for action. Basically, there's nothing that you need to do about them, there's nothing that you need to do in consequence to them, right? Just because you know about them, there's no accountability related to them. وَلَا يَتَعَلَّقْ بِهَا تَكْلِيفِ سِوَى الْإِيمَانِ بِهَا. All you're responsible for is you believe that it's there, that it came, it's in the Quran or the Sunnah. And وَيُمْكِنُ الْإِيمَانُ بِهَا مِنْ غَيْرِ عِلْمِ مَعْنَاهَا. Subhanallah, that is so blatant, so clear, right? And it is absolutely possible to have belief in these things without knowing their meaning. Without knowing their meaning. Whether it's even reality, whether it's even haqiqah or majaz, even that's not a requirement. فَإِنَّ الْإِيمَانَ بِالْجَهْلِ صَحِيحٌ. فَإِنَّ الْإِيمَانَ بِالْجَهْلِ صَحِيحٌ. Because knowledge based on ignorance, belief even based on ignorance of the reality of something is absolutely valid, because you're saying whatever Allah means by that, I accept it. right? فإن الله سبحانه وتعالى أمر بالإيمان بملائكته وكتبه ورسله وما أنزل إليهم وإن كنا لا نعرف من ذلك إلا التسمية. Allahu Akbar. What an example. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to believe in the angels, in his other books, and in his many other messengers, and that which was revealed upon them, even though all we know of them are names. We've never seen Yusuf alayhi salam. We've not seen the scriptures of Ibrahim alayhi salam or Adam alayhi salam. We haven't seen him. We haven't seen the angels, right? We haven't seen many of the other books. We've seen, remnants and changed versions of some of them, but we haven't seen that, but we still have to believe in them, right? So it's absolutely fine. What a beautiful example. What a beautiful example. Another statement of his, which is again from the same source as I quoted above, he says, as far as our iman and our belief in the verses and the hadith with regards to sifat, then it is just a belief regarding its wording, that these words have come. التي لا شك في صحتها. There's no doubt that these words have been mentioned and have been reliably transmitted. ولا ريب في صدقها. And there is absolutely no doubt with regards to their veracity. وقائلها أعلم بمعناها. But the one who stated them, the one who said them, he is most knowledgeable regarding its meaning. فآمنا بها على المعنى الذي أراد ربنا عز وجل. And our belief in them is based on the same meaning, whatever that is, that Allah has intended by them. That's all we're required for, right? That's all that's required of us. Now, I'm going to move on from Ibn Qudama, all right, to another great Hanbali scholar whose name is Abdurrahman Abu al-Faraj Ibn al-Jawzi, al-Imam al-Hafidh al-Mufassir, right, who died in 597, as I mentioned before. He says, Allahu Akbar. He says, الواجب علينا أن نعتقد أن ذات الله تعالى لا يحويه مكان ولا يوصف بالتغير والانتقال. It's obligatory upon us to believe, to hold this belief that the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be encompassed by any place, and neither can he be described and attributed with movement, with change in movement. Subhanallah, right? Now, Ibn al-Jawzi also mentions in his book that that is the aqidah of the Salaf and the aqidah of Imam Ahmad. What is the aqidah of Imam Ahmad and the Salaf is تنزيه الله تعالى عن الجهة والمكان والحد والجسمية والقيام والجلوس والاستقرار وغيرها من الصفات الحوادث والأجسام, is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be deemed transcendent from direction, from place, from limitation, from being a body, from standing up, from sitting, from establishing and resting on something, and all other attributes of bodies. All of that is comes from him, and you can get this from his book called Daf'u Shubah at-Tashbih. I believe that book has been translated, right? I believe that book has been translated by Amal Press, if I remember correctly, right? Sheikh Abdullah Hamid Ali, he translated that book. Beautiful book by Ibn al-Jawzi. So Ibn al-Jawzi carries on and he says, you're going فترى أقواما يسمعون أخبار الصفات. You're going to see certain people who hear the various different narrations with regards to the attributes, and then فيحملوا, he repudiated a lot of these deviants, right? He says فيحملونها على ما يقتضيه الحس. They then go ahead and interpret them according to what perception demands, what physical perception demands. For example, one of them says that ينزل بذاته إلى السماء, that Allah descends with his whole entity, لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله, right, to the heaven. وينتقل, and he moves, he transfers himself. وهذا فهم رديء. This is a very aberrant and a very ugly understanding and comprehension. لأن المنتقل يكون من مكان إلى مكان. Because if you say that somebody moves, then what that means is that they move from one space and place to another place. Right. Now, if you believe that they move from one place to another place, then what's going to happen is that necessitates that the place that they're moving from to should be bigger than them for them to be able to move within that space. If I say that this cup moves from here to here, then that means that the space around it obviously encompasses it and is bigger than it because it can move from one place to the other. right? That's what they're saying. That means that place and space becomes greater than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says another thing that this entails and this demands is وَيَلْزَمْ مِنْهُ الْحَرَكَةِ, movement and motion. That is what it entails as well. All of this then he says is muhal, is inconceivable for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? I'm really sorry if this has kind of thrown you into the deep end, but these are the big difference, and it becomes very necessary to understand that the pure Hanbali Aqidah represented by these individuals is the exact same, right? Even though they may have emphasized certain points more and they did not do interpretation, right? Is the same as the Ash'ari Maturidi opinion. The Ash'ari Maturidi earlier opinion is that you do not do any ta'wil, whereas the later opinion said it's okay to do because the Sahaba did it, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that the pure Hanbalis, they were just much more stricter on that. However, the aberrant Hanbalis, the ones who went off track and who but claim to be followers of Imam Ahmad and represent Imam Ahmad, they have read into this and said, yes, you don't do ta'wil, but you don't do full tafweed. They say you do tafweed, but what they're saying is that you have to believe in the reality. But in all of these quotes, there's never been a discussion of reality, right? Haqiqah versus majaz. This is what they insist on. Otherwise, they would say that this is a waste of time. Now, why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveal something that you didn't know its meaning, right? So the answer to that is what Ibn Qudama, etc. already said, right? Okay, another thing that Ibn al-Jawzi says is that كُلُّ مَنْ هُوَ فِي جِهَةٍ يَكُونُ مُقَدَّرًا مَحْدُودًا. Anybody who is going to be deemed to be, in one of the different, directions, then they would have to, they have to be limited and they have to be determinable, right? In terms of size, shape, or whatever. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond that. He says directions are only for substance, people with atom and bodies, because they are physical mass that require to be in a distance as compared to something relative to something else. And once we've established that you can't have Allah in any direction, then that means Allah can't be in a space either, because direction and space are concomitant, they go together, right? So he says that again in his Daf'u Shubah Tashbih, that the previous quote of his actually was from his other book, right? Where he says that if he's moving from one place to the other, then that means that the space would be larger than him. That's actually from his other wonderful book called Saydul Khatir, Capturing the Stray Thoughts, right? Which is like his blog, you could say. That's another book of his. He's got lots of ruminations and kind of blog posts in there, right? At a time when there was no such thing as blogs as such, like in the modern sense. Okay, another thing he says, you see, he understands all the objections because he was dealing with them firsthand, right? It seems. That's why he's responding to them. He says, فَإِنْ قِيلَ نفي الجهات يحيل وجوده قلنا إن كان الموجود يقبل الاتصال والانفصال فقد صدقت أو فقد صدقت فأما إذا لم يقبلهما فليس خلوه من طرف النقيض بمحال. He says that if somebody makes an objection that if you're denying direction, then that means that if you're denying direction, then that means that you can't have direction. Then it means that it's inconceivable to have, it's inconceivable for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be existent. We would say that, yes, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was something that was existent, that accepted to be linked to something else or to be separated from something else, then yes, if he was an entity such as that, then yes, you're telling the truth, then your objection would be clear. However, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an essence that does not accept to be joined and linked to something or separated from something, right? So then there's no problem that he doesn't have place. Then that does not lead to an inconceivability. Okay, mashallah, mashallah, mashallah. So we've finished with Ibn al-Jawzi's quote. Now we move on to point number 7, right? Point number 7. Now this one, we're going to the next point. Imam al-Mufassir Sirajuddin ibn Adil al-Hanbali al-Dimashqi. He's from Damascus. This is another Hanbali scholar who died in 775 Hijri, so 2 centuries after, nearly 2 centuries after Ibn al-Jawzi. He says, اختلفت الأمة في تفسير يد الله تعالى. The Ummah, meaning the Muslims, have differed with regards to an explanation of the hand of Allah, right? The Mujassima, which means that the pure anthropomorphists, they said that, oh, it's a udhun, it's a limb, a physical bodily limb, just like everybody else has, every other human being have. They said, why? Because the name hand, or yad in Arabic, right, which is hand in English, right, has been coined for this limb. So if you're going to apply this to any other meaning, then you would be abandoning the linguistic meaning here, and that's not allowed, because Allah says it's a hand, so it must mean a physical hand, because that's exactly what it means. Allahu Akbar. How do you answer that? He says, this is Sirajuddin ibn Adil al-Hanbali al-Dimashqi, right, died in 775. What he says is that Allah is not a body, because bodies can't be separated from devoid of motion or motionlessness. And both motion and motionlessness are created beings, are created aspects. And something that can't be devoid of created aspects can't be non-created themselves. So you can't have an eternal being who's not created linked to created beings so closely like that. Then he says another thing is that, okay, if Allah is a jism, then any body or jism, any body, any mass like that, is eventually going to be ending, right? So it has to be defined, so it has to come to an end, so it has to have a certain length and a breadth and so on. And that means that, and anything which is limited, right, in any in its amount, then that has to be created, right? Because there's something greater than it that created it. The other thing he says is that every jism, every body, is made up of different parts, right? It has components, atoms, and so on. And everything that is of that nature, which is components, made up of components, and is compound in that fashion, has to be dependent on somebody that brought it together, and that brings it together, and that makes the compound. So anything like that has to be created, because it needs a creator and a maker of it. With all of these things, he says that this all establishes that it is absolutely inconceivable for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be a jism, a body. So that means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can't have, right, and the meaning of these words can't be that they mean a limb, that they be taken to be a limb. That's why we have to go beyond that. We have to go beyond that, right? And we're going to go into a bit more detail of this that you'll understand, inshallah. So let's look at that. So he carries on with the discussion. He says, when it comes to the majority of us monotheist Muslims, they have two opinions with regards to the hand. The word yad in Arabic, which can be translated as hand in English, there are two ways to look at hand, right? When you hear the word hand. The first one is the opinion of those who say that when the Quran has indicated towards there being a yad or a hand for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we believe in Allah, all right, and we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, our rational faculty has indicated that the hand of Allah could mean, right? Our rational faculty absolutely prohibits for hand of Allah to mean that it is a certain limb or a bodily part. You know, a compound bodily part made up of flesh, blood, whatever it is, right? Of different parts, right? So, but we believe that Allah has a yad because Allah has mentioned it, right? He's mentioned in multiple places, so we believe in it, right? However, then they say, what exactly is this hand? How are we supposed to take this hand, and what is its reality? What is its وَمَا حَقِيقَتُهَا? Now, this is very, very telling. Remember, I said that this is probably the first time in all of these quotes, right, that the word haqiqah has come about. Haqiqah as opposed to majaz, for example, right? That this is either literal or metaphorical. They never have that discussion. But here he brings the word haqiqah in the sense that what is the reality of this hand? We believe that there is a yad, a hand, but what exactly is the reality? فَقَدْ فَوَّضْنَا مَعْرِفَتَهَا إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. We have consigned its understanding and knowledge to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the tariqatul salaf. This is the way of the salaf, he says. So that was the first approach, he says, to the hand that Muslims have had. The second approach, he said, is the approach of the mutakallimin, the theologians who went a bit deeper into this. They said that, look, when you use the word hand, casually in any language, right, or at least in the Arabic language, and I think English is very, very similar to Arabic in the usage of the word hand, right? So they're saying that, look, let's take it that in a common discourse, right, in a casual statement or even formal writing, the word hand is used for multiple meanings, all right? Now think about yourself, multiple meanings, these all will resonate with you. First meaning is that it obviously refers to a limb, right? The bodily limb, right? That's a primary meaning of it. Second one is that it refers to ni'mah and bounty, right? It refers to bounty, like I've got my hand on it, don't worry on it, don't worry, they're in my hands and I'll look after it. Number three is strength, right, which is a lot more intuitive, right? It means power and energy, right? That it's it's in my hands, I've got control over it, basically. Rabi'uha, it refers to ownership. Oh, I've got it in my hands now, right? I've got my hands on it, which means that I purchased it, it's mine now, I've got sovereignty over it. And the fifth one is shiddatul inayati wal ikhtisas, for somebody to be very, very, very specifically focused and specified with something, right? Something specific focus and to pay full attention to something, that something is within my major concern. That is another thing about concern, like take it in your hands and deal with it, right? Now, once we recognize this, we would say that when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which one of these five meanings would apply, right? Out of them, the first one is definitely mumtani, he says. Out of these, the first one is definitely prohibited, that you believe in a limb, because that just creates all of these issues that we've just dismissed so far, right? All the other meanings, they could all apply. That the hand of Allah could mean Allah's bounties. The hand of Allah could mean that His power, His sovereignty, His very specific focus and interest in something. Nothing wrong with those meanings. As you can see, that ta'wil doesn't have any problematic connotation. So what's wrong with it in that sense? However, the safest approach, we just leave it to Allah. But if you have to have a meaning, the later scholar said it's fine. Okay, that was that. Now let's move on to the next point, right? The next point. Again, we go back to Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali in this case, who died in 795 here, right? He says that the correct opinion which the Salaf are upon is that you need to pass these verses of attributes along and the ahadith exactly as they've come. You leave it as they are, without any kind of tafsir of it, without showing any determining the howness of it, or providing any kind of example for it. And it is not permitted and valid for anybody to go against this in any sense, right? No, he says that it's not transmitted from anybody to go against it, meaning nobody has said that you can go against this, right? Especially from Imam Ahmad, was very strict about this. And neither he says that it is allowed to engross oneself with its meaning, or nor to provide any such, comparative examples or anything like that. He says what we should follow here are the Imams of Islam, like Ibn al-Mubarak, Abdullah ibn Mubarak, Imam Malik ibn Anas, Imam al-Thawri, Imam al-Awza'i, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad, Imam Ishaq ibn Rahuya, Abu Ubaid, and the likes of it. All of them went with the same opinion. Okay, number 9. The 9th quote we have is from Al-Allama Al-Mar'i Al-Maqdisi Al-Hanbali. Mar'i Al-Maqdisi Al-Hanbali rahimahullah died in 1033 Hijri. He says, Madhab al-Salaf, the way the school of the Salaf is to not involve oneself in anything like this, and to be silent about it, and to consign its knowledge to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu said that هذا من المكتوم الذي لا يفسر. This is from the hidden, concealed, veiled ideas that cannot be explained. There's no explanation for them. So فالأولى في هذه الآية وما شاكلها أن يؤمن الإنسان بظاهرها. So the preferred position, a superior position in all of these, right, is for the insan to believe in them with whatever the apparent wording of it is, and يكل علمها إلى الله تعالى, and leave the meaning of it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is exactly what he says the Imams of the Salaf passed on. And Sufyan ibn Uyayna rahimahullah says that anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has characterized himself by in his book, the tafsir of it is to read it and then to be silent of it. It is not permitted for anybody to give any kind of explanation of it except Allah and His Messenger. Let's move on to the next one. The next one is number 10 actually. Imam Safarini, As-Safarini, who died in 1188, right? I'm going to quickly go through some of these. He says, Madhab of the Salaf is to not delve into the likes of this, and to remain silent, and to leave its knowledge to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's his first quote. His second quote is, our Lord is not a substance, nor is He an accident, nor is He a body, and He is way transcendent above this. Subhanahu, may He be purified and glorified. He had istiwa, as has been transmitted. Now again, look at what he says. As has been transmitted, without any kind of kayf. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be limited. Then he says, likewise are the concepts of anger and satisfaction when attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all the other attributes that have come in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said them. The Salaf of the Ummah and the Ulama'ul A'imma, they believe in them, they establish them for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the meaning that Allah has intended. See, there's no discussion again of him saying, oh, you better take the literal meaning here and you must reject the metaphorical meaning. This is what the detractors keep saying. He says, you should establish it as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the intention, with the meaning that He's intended, while also having the full belief in the transcendence and the purification of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from any kind of resemblance or any kind of shortcoming in that regard. So there you go. Those were, there are many, many more. There are many, many more. We've just selected, a certain number. At the end of the day, what you understand, what we can say from a summary of all of this is that consignment, leaving the attributes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their meaning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and just believing in them the way they are without any kind of explanation, was the madhab of the elect Hanbalis, right? Meaning the majority of the Hanbalis, right? That essentially is what represents throughout the Hanbalis, the major dominating opinion among them, right? Not just among the later ones, but the early ones, and that comes all the way from Imam Ahmad rahimahullahu ta'ala. MashaAllah. So to conclude, I hope this hasn't been too much for you, but I think it's important to understand that there's a plethora of this kind of statements from all the Hanbali scholars. I'm just going to end with two final discussions here, two final quotes here, just so that you understand that there's actually no difference between the Ash'aris and the Maturidis in terms of the fundamental masail. The only thing is that the Hanbalis, they would insist, the proper Hanbalis would insist that you don't do ta'wil at all, right? But that everything else is the exact same, and they don't insist on the literal meaning either. So for example, let's look at Abdul Baqi al-Hanbali. He starts his aqidah, which means that his creedal text, when he relates it from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, right? And so what he does is that he also explains the tafweed. So this is what he says. He says, مُعْظَمُ مَا نَقَلْنَاهُ مِنْ أُصُولِنَا وَفُرُوعِنَا مُتَّصِلٌ فِي جَمِيعِ الْأَعْصَارِ من زمن الإمام أحمد رحمه الله إلى زمننا متواتر نقله جمع عن جمع. So he's saying that whatever he has clarified, this wasn't some aberrant opinion in the Hanbali school. He says that the majority of that which we have transmitted, right, of our usul, our fundamental principles, and our substantive tenets, they're connected throughout the different generations, from the time of Imam Ahmad rahimahullah to our time itself. They are contiguously mutawatir, so widespread, transmitted from a major group to the next major group, right? So that's Abdul Baqi al-Hanbali. He starts off that with that statement, right, which you can find in Al-Ayn wal-Athar fi Aqaidi Ahli al-Athar. Then the next statement is from Lawami'ul Anhar al-Bahiyya from Allama Safarini. He says, "I'lam anna madhhab al-Hanabila wa madhhab al-Salaf." The madhhab of the Hanabila is the madhhab of the pious predecessors. They describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with only what he describes himself with, and that which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has described him with, without any kind of interpolation, without any kind of cancellation, without any kind of howness, without any kind of example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an entity that does not resemble any other entity. He is attributed with the attributes of perfection, that which does not resemble the attributes of any of creation. When the Quran or the Sahih Hadith comes with any characterization, we accept it, we submit to it, and we establish it according to the way it has been according to the way it has come in the Quran Sunnah. And وَنَكِلُ مَعْنَاهُ, we leave the meaning of it to Al-Aziz Al-Hakim, the mighty and the wise one. And this, he says, is the i'tiqad and the belief of all of the Hanabila, just as it was the opinion of all of the Salaf. And whoever goes against this, then he's gone away and deviated from the straight path, right? So, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam. This is the end of this discussion. As you can see from here, that they're very, very, very similar, and there's hardly any difference between them. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.